Hello, and welcome to Hidden in Plain Sight, the racist economy of court fees and fines, part of a series of live events presented by the National Center for Youth Law, which is proud to celebrate 50 years of impact in 2021. We are delighted to have today's discussion moderated by our own Attasi Uppal, Senior Policy Attorney, Juvenile Justice and Education. Attasi, welcome, and thank you for moderating today's discussion.
Hi, everyone. I'm Attasi Uppal. Welcome to what I hope will be an illuminating conversation, uncovering the deep roots and significant impacts of the costs young people have to pay when they're involved with court systems across the country. As Patty announced, my name is Attasi, and I'm an attorney at the National Center for Youth Law. So many of you probably know that young people can be arrested, charged, and incarcerated in America, just like adults. Across the United States, these are disproportionately young people of color, particularly Indigenous, Latino, and African American youth. And they range in ages as young as 8 all the way to their early 20s, depending on the rules in the states where they live. But what you may not realize is that on top of the strict rules of probation that they have to follow and the jail time that they must experience, courts also charge them and their families money. We call these costs fees and fines because young people face these costs in 2 ways. Fees, which are associated with so-called services of the system, like the nightly cost of jail, and fines, which are financial penalties that are associated with ordinance violations or other legal violations. Today's speakers are some of my colleagues in the movement to eliminate these fees and fines. We all see that fees and fines can increase offense rates, exacerbate wealth disparities, and most importantly, lead to painful rifts in families and communities. We know that these costs can follow young people and their families for years, if not for multiple generations. So we are working across the country for what we call debt-free justice. So joining me today are Marcus Jarvis. He could give a little wave, Outreach and Communications Associate at the Juvenile Law Center in Pennsylvania. Jason Smith, the Executive Director at the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, and Brett Murfish, Director of Youth Justice at Texas Appleseed. Thanks so much to all of you for joining this live stream today. I know for some of us, this is our first ever live stream where we get to talk about issues we're really passionate about, and I appreciate you making the time. So I'd love to get us started in the conversation. Marcus, I'm wondering if you can ground us and our audience today in the impacts of this system on young people, and particularly young people of color. So for people who are hearing about fees and fines for the first time, what have you heard and what do you know about the devastating impact of these costs on young people?
Yeah, there's being my personal experience gives a lot of clarity to gave me a lot of clarity on the ridiculousness of the fines and the fees in the system as a child who was in the foster care system. As a child who was in the foster care system, and shout out to my kids. But yeah, when I initially had, experiences with fines in the system, your social workers and people that you deal with in the system immediately tell you they won't pay for anything, any of your fines. So they just kind of linger around until you get older. And then once you turn 18, they're just all on you. But if a person did have a parent, the parent is actually liable for those fines for that amount of time. And then it may turn into you turning 18 and maybe the parent splits the fine between the child, but the state, takes a stance of no, we don't pay anything and it's all on you. And, I just turned 30 years old and I'm still paying off fines associated with the case that I caught when I was 16. And if my fines weren't as high as some of, I feel like my fines are lower than some of the more outrageous numbers that I, see and hear about, just somebody paying like $8,000 for a tooth, like their kid stealing a tube of toothpaste out of a store, like, and the person only makes $16,000 a year. Like that is just like, so it's literally half of a parent's salary for the entire year would be owed to the system, you know, before they even work the year. And they are already expected to pay this money. And then it's like, there's so many, like, so many collateral consequences on, they say that there's no debt prisons, but if you're on probation and you don't pay a debt, then you are in prison. Like it's a violation of your probation. So, you know, they just kind of although it's not worded as like a person is locked up for a certain amount of money, that's not what they say when they're arrested. They just say it's a violation of probation or a violation of parole. But in reality, the person just didn't have the money to pay that, and then it can just get down into, you know, a person who gets out on a felony, you can only make but so much money because there's only but so many good jobs offering you, you know, or a young person that can only work, you know, your work permit only gives you a certain amount of hours per week you can work, but you're charged money as though you can actually work a 40-hour week when kids cannot even work a 40-hour week. And even if you were a person who got out of prison who did work a 40-hour week, that would only pay for you to live somewhere at the wage that you would be able to get as a felon or a person who's coming out of prison. So it kind of sets you up into this trap of, you know, if you don't have any support outside of yourself, it has to be paid for by somebody else. So you have to put the burden on, you know, a family member. If you don't have any family to pay it off, then it could lead a person to want to do some illegal activity to try to, you know, just to be in good standing with probation. Like when like I don't, like when my probation calls me, if they ever, my probation officer calls me right now, my heart's gonna drop because I know I owe them people like $800 I'm not really, I'm not trying to pay them people that money right now. And if they call me right now and my phone rang and I seen this at probation, that's the first thing I'm gonna think of because, and he might just call and say, you know, just checking up on you. But that's the first thing that's gonna pop into my mind because I know that they're charging me an amount of money per month for me being on probation. Every person that kind of, and there's so many of these type of charges that people deal with in the system and have to like get past, you know, try to get through regular life. And, you know, like people are already struggling in regular life. And it's just like really difficult to try to deal with regular life and these fines.
In your experience, Marcus, have you seen that people in the community really know what's happening with these fees and fines? And I think maybe Marcus is talking to his own kids right now, but Marcus, have you seen that people in the community who don't know about the juvenile justice system are familiar with these costs, or is it a surprise to even like judges or other people involved in the court system that kids are picking up this debt?
I really don't think people understand. Like I think people do have a certain awareness about it, whereas though like you might think of a kid throwing a baseball through a window and feeling like okay they should, you know, be liable for the money that, you know, they owe for this baseball, but they're just looking at it like, you know, a kid breaks a window and they owe the money for this ball or this window being broken. It's never just the window broken. It's court calls, like it's probation, it's all of these fees that's on top of it. So even if a kid did owe money for breaking a window, that, you know, $200 window goes into $1,200 as soon as it enters the system because you have the kid is basically paying for all of these adults' jobs that have to deal with this situation, whereas though they broke this window and it cost the $200. Now they have to pay $1,000 in administrative fees. And that's the part where people don't really see, whereas though a person just only kind of thinks about, okay, that initial liability of something was done, something was wrong, was done, although the juvenile justice system is not supposed to be punitive at all. And that is what we have as an adult system where, you know, it's punitive, where if a person does something, then they should be reprimanded for it. But and the system is supposed to be rehabilitative, I couldn't see what is rehabilitative about forcing a person to pay something when they are not allowed to, like, you're literally not allowed to work a certain amount of hours as a young person, but they don't take that into account when they're charged. Like, no judge has ever, I've never seen that taken into account when a person is assessed fines or fees in the system, because they're not, like, young people shouldn't be seen as, fiscally liable for these things that just don't make any, like, young people don't, like, they can't pay for themselves to, go to school. They don't pay for their clothes or pretty much anything. There's nothing else that a young person is expected to pay for but a fine or a fee if they are involved in the justice system some type of way.
Thanks so much, Marcus, for building that out a bit. And I'd love to toss it to Jason here. Hearing Marcus's example, which I think is a very real one of that, $200 of damage turning into $1,200 of more costs. What kinds of amounts have has your organization in Michigan seen families experience in terms of fees and fines?
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Marcus, for sharing your story and your experience and lifting up the experiences of families that you've seen that have dealt with juvenile court debt. Here in Michigan, I mean, we have heard stories that really run the gamut, run the range of big amounts to small amounts that families have been assessed fines and fees by the juvenile court. We have heard stories and actually seen bills from courts that families have shared with us for huge, outrageous amounts, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, up to $100,000 for the cost of care and services for the child's court involvement. Like Marcus mentioned, we're not even necessarily talking about restitution or repairing some sort of harm or damages to a victim. We're talking about things like attorney fees, a young person's reimbursing the court for a young person's stay in detention or long-term residential treatment facilities, which can really vary county by county in what is assessed, the amount that's assessed, the process that the court looks at, ability to pay for a family, and how aggressive a court is in collecting that money. We've heard stories from families who have attempted to make payment plans, have struggled to make it for whatever reason, especially during the pandemic, where a lot of families have seen financial uncertainty and lost employment, only to have whatever financial concerns they have exacerbated by loss of wages. And we even heard a story of a father who was on a payment plan, lost his job, and then started to have his unemployment garnished to pay back juvenile court debt. And even though we heard some really outrageous stories and huge amounts, I don't want to downplay the significance of even small amounts and the impact that it can have on families who did not plan to have this payment as a part of their household budget. $30, $40, $50, $100 extra a month going towards juvenile court fees can really be financially harmful for a family. That's money that could be used for pro-social activities for kids outside of their justice system involvement to ensure that they aren't involved in the future or have the tools that they need to thrive once court involvement ends, or their siblings. And families across the state who have to deal with the situation have to make that decision, whether they're going to make payments towards the court or make payments towards something else if there is no ability to have those fees waived.
It's been hard to hear about the impact on young people as individuals, on families, as Jason just shared. There's a ripple effect here, I think, that we're hearing about. And Brett, I'm wondering if you, in your work in Texas, have seen any particular impact on communities of color or communities from certain socioeconomic levels.
Well, I feel like Marcus and Jason hit kind of all of like really hit the high points of, why fines and fees are an issue for young people and why we shouldn't really be assessing them the way we are. I think the one thing that I would add is just the disproportionate impact. We already have young people of color disproportionately represented in our justice system, and then we disproportionately assess fees and fines to them. Obviously, some of the fees are like just underwritten in the system. So those aren't necessarily like discretionary, but the ones that are, we do often see that also disproportionately applied, sort of like an over-representation and an over-punishment. And then the other part that I thought, makes, I think Marcus really kept saying the word rehabilitative. Like our system, our juvenile justice system is supposed to be rehabilitative. And so what it does is it puts the people who are supposed to be helping that rehabilitation. Now, whether we think the justice system does a good job of that is like different question, but it puts them sort of those probation department officers, it makes them the debt collectors instead of being sort of potential, role models or support systems or whatever, they could be doing in that role that could rehabilitative effect. So I think the ripple effect is that the people that are in the juvenile justice system who are supposed to be, having this rehabilitative role are then placed in a role of being kind of an enforcer of a debt that may or may not even seem related to the particular, offense or charge, the reason the child's involved.
That's a really helpful point that you're making, Brett. And I think it relates well to another question I have, which is just thinking about the role that the juvenile justice system wants to have and how there's a lot of advocacy happening in many parts of that system. Fees and fines aren't always the first thing that advocates think of when it comes to reforming the juvenile justice system or interrogating what it's really about. So, Jason, I'm curious how and why your organization, the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, thinks the fees and fines work that you're doing fits into the larger picture of reform in Michigan, and how you've been kind of thinking of that narrative.
Yeah, sure. So we want to see the Michigan juvenile justice system be fair and effective for all kids who come in contact with it, no matter who you are, what your background is, and where you live. And right now, because our system is a decentralized judicial system, a young person's experience can really vary depending on where they are. Like I mentioned, the assessment and collection of fines and fees can really look different depending on where they are. We know, like Brett mentioned, that young people are disproportionately, youth of color, I should say, are disproportionately involved with the justice system, and at the latter stages of the justice system, like confinement, that are more costly if families are assessed fees related to it. And so we view this as an issue of racial justice. We are really interested in seeing Michigan's juvenile justice system become anti-racist, meaning that it's intentional and shifting its policies and practices to with an understanding that historically youth of color, Black, Brown, Native youth have been disproportionately harmed by the justice system. And we understand that institutional racism starts way before the juvenile justice system, and to a certain extent, the system is serving kids who were failed by other institutions, right? And I know personally people who are working in the system who want to make that change. They believe, like others have said today, that the system should be rehabilitative first. Young people can be held accountable, but you shouldn't punish them financially and their family financially. One of the things that we often hear from court stakeholders is that one of the driving factors for justice involvement and some of the struggles that young people face once they become justice involved is family dynamic issues. Adding economic uncertainty or financial pressures from juvenile court fees only exacerbates that and makes that worse. And so it creates a barrier, kind of like Brett said, it creates a barrier between those who want to help a young person address their needs, get off of court supervision, move on with the rest of their life, it creates a barrier between them and the families in achieving that goal. When more and more we're seeing court stakeholders strive to have a collaborative relationship with families. I mean, we've heard families say that, I know that the goal is for us to have an open line of communication between us and the courts, and us share, if there's any kind of issue, so that we can work through it. But why do that? If there's a concern that it may bring another financial cost on us? So our system has been doing a lot of work around legislative reform to make it more rehabilitative, increase services and programming for youth, especially community-based care and diversion. We view this as another way to ensure that Michigan's juvenile justice system matches what it says it is on paper.
Thanks, Jason. And, I have to say, on a personal note, when I first got involved in this work years ago, I had no idea how this fit into the larger picture. And what really struck me in speaking with families is how they've always known. They don't have the privilege of not knowing, and they feel it so much in their monthly budgeting and their daily conversations with their children. So, as advocates, sometimes, especially as advocates like myself who haven't had lived experience in this system, we're lucky that this is our first exposure, our earliest exposure to the system. And I appreciate you sharing how this fits into the bigger picture, because I think that's something that we need to do with all of our reform work. We need to show how it's all tied together and moving toward the same goal of actually supporting the young people that we're trying to hold accountable. So I wanted to just give a minute to Brett and see if you wanted to share how this fits into the larger work that Texas Appleseed is doing in Texas, because I know you've had work, kind of over 10 years related to specifically and tangentially related to fees and fines reform.
Sure. So yes, we, sort of economic justice is an underlying part of a lot of our work at Texas Appleseed. So I think you're referring to some of the ticketing in schools that often came fines to that we work to get rid of, and fines around truancy that we successfully decriminalized. As we were talking, I kept thinking, we know that like kids aren't mini adults, and yet like our juvenile system, it's like we just took our adult system and like minied it. And obviously that makes no sense. And I think that also assumes the adult system is good, which is like, again, like a huge assumption to make. But, I think Marcus was talking about how, fees and fines in our adult system pay for the justice system. Well, one of the things in Texas that really helped in terms of our strategies and tactics was that, the revenue that's coming from these fees and fines is paying like 0.1% of the juvenile budget. So it's like, what is the point? We're putting this burden on families, we're increasing recidivism, we're, driving a wedge between them and rehabilitation. And then we're not even like, it's cost negative. So we're actually losing money because we're having to pay people to collect. And then it's also, even if we were to collect, would barely offset the budget. And so, I think, in Texas, we were able to have, some success this past legislative session. We got rid of about like half of our fees in our system. And so we hope to pass the others. And some of the sort of like strategies and tactics that worked was one, what I just referred to, that cost analysis. So for instance, like in Harris County, I think I overstated it. It made up 0.01% of the budget. I mean, how ridiculous, right? And of the juvenile probation's like annual budget, it was like 0.3%. Texas is not purple yet, especially with our new maps. And so, you have to have bipartisanship, but you really have to have Republicans. And so in our state, that really means talking about fiscal impacts and really also about rehabilitation. Juvenile justice is a bipartisan issue. Like our children are, our future, not to be cheesy, but like, I do think that appeals to both sides of the aisle. And sort of just that focus on rehabilitation is really impactful, and one that we, hammered on. I think also attaching it to a larger bill package. There's more and more awareness about getting rid of civil fees and sort of the impact they have on adults. And because our juvenile system is part of our civil system, we were able to attach it there. And so it fell in with that narrative as well. And then the last thing that I think really, or not the last thing, but another sort of two other strategies that worked for us in terms of that messaging that we always are talking about. One is this sort of positioning of now we know better. So it helped, the same thing with our truancy work. Like you used to think that, kids not in school, you send them to a judge, you give them tough consequences and that'll get them back and scared straight, right? Or, same thing with our justice system, they should have to pay for what they've done and this will teach them. And it's like, okay, that might have been what we thought in like the 80s and the 90s, but now we know better. And we have the data and the science to show that we have all of these negative effects. And, this has gone across our work. So with like curfew ordinances, same messaging. And we've been able to get rid of those in several cities and are pushing for statewide ban on those. And so I think that sort of helps people kind of take them off the defensive, like, because they might think that this is a good thing, but when you show them the evidence and talk about it that way, that can be sort of a way of disarming the conversation and neutralizing it. And then I think the whole thing about pushing children deeper into the system. So, the fact that, now that child, when they turn, we haven't raised the age yet. So when they turn 17, they can have a warrant out for their arrest. If they get in trouble again, those fees show up. And we actually have stories of young people who ended up in the county jail because they had a ticket and then it went unpaid and then the fines mounted. It sort of, it snowballs into a greater amount. They turn 17, they get picked up and then they have these debts. So they were sitting in the county jail. And unfortunately, in that case, what happened is that they sat in the jail for the number of hours and for each hour, they just ticked off money for the fine. So the child was there for like 48 hours. I mean, come on, nobody thinks that's a good idea. So I know I've thrown a lot out there, but yeah, that's sort of some of the messaging and tactics that we talked about, that kind of connected back to our broader economic justice sort of framework. And also, we're specific to the juvenile justice fees and fines.
I think it's really helpful to hear, what's working in a place like Texas, which isn't, like you've said, a political climate that's super friendly to certain types of justice reform. And, Marcus, your job is to do communications and outreach work to support campaigns across the country in various states that are trying to eliminate fees and fines for young people. So I'm curious to know if any of what Brett has shared around like messaging that resonates has come up for you in your work, or if there's something kind of different that you feel works to convince people in power that this is not an actually effective strategy. Marcus, I'm not getting your sound, but I'm not sure if others are.
Yeah, sorry about that. I really agree with everything that she was just saying. I'm actually one of those young people who was a debt prisoner at a certain point. I was arrested for my fines and fees that I owed for being in a Lackawanna County jail for 11 and a half months. So I was arrested solely for the charge of I was held in CFCF. Lackawanna County drove to Philadelphia, picked me up, drove me handcuffed and shackled in the back of a cop car, 2.5 hours to Lackawanna County. I sat in the prison. Then they took me to this really crooked seeming judge, and they were like, are you going to pay the money today? And if not, you can either sit for 6 months or you can work in this program that we have to pay off the fine. I was like, I have a job. I work for Juvenile Law Center. I'm working at the Eagle Stadium. Can I just make a payment plan? They were like, those are your two options. So I had to go and be in recycle. It was like a forced labor program. Like, I mean, it's not technically forced because I guess we do have free will, but the entire, block of those people in prison were all in that same situation where we all owed fines. And I had to work, I think it was like 22 days to pay off that maybe $1,200 or $1,100 that it was that I owed for that particular fine for being in the county jail. So even just hearing somebody talk about it, it's something that it comes up in different times, like just for different situations. I was just talking to my wife about me going to school. Like I just started Montgomery County Community College. It was literally my first day of college. And I had just got stopped for being Black walking down the street, and I had a warrant. And that warrant, took me so far away from where I was in life that, I never actually finished college from there. I literally never went back to college since then, because I just never had to. I ended up starting to have kids and like just having like a real life that I have like more and more bills like that alone, being arrested. Like then once you have to be locked up to pay off the fines, like you still got rent and bills and things when you get out. So it's not as though like, that just kind of exacerbates the problem a lot more. And then another thing, like even just the kind of racial nature of it was just something that kind of came up to me, like how in Wisconsin there were kids like, so when kids do would get arrested for, like, if Black kids in Wisconsin would get arrested in a stolen car, they would get grand theft auto and like really higher charges. And if the white kids out there were getting charged with like joyriding. And that's just another way that, the system, unfairly, puts those fines on, Black kids, because even with the charges that, young Black kids are charged. Like I was in Lackawanna County, I was caught with, some drugs, and I was certified as an adult at 16. I'm 100% sure there was other, kids that were caught in Lackawanna County with drugs, and they were not certified as adults. That was my first offense. I wasn't no, prolific criminal. I didn't have any violent charges. I didn't have any violent offenses in my record, nothing like that. My mom had just died a year and a half ago. I had dropped out of school. I was in the foster care system. There was a bunch of reasons for them to like give me some type of leniency, but that court system decided I was a kid to certify as an adult and like give the maximum, charge to. So these type of court systems, the way they deal out the charges, or the way these judges give out these fines and these certain sentences to people are, a lot different based on the demographic of who the person is that's receiving it. I did see some questions pop up.
Thanks, Marcus. And, I just want to acknowledge how, you don't have to share these things in your role as an advocate. And I really appreciate that you chose to today. And I'm so sorry for these things that have happened to you and all of these young people in Texas and Michigan, Wisconsin. One message that I'm hearing through what you're saying is like, people are trying to get on the right track. They're trying to lean into the rehabilitative purpose of the juvenile justice system. And it's like just fees and fines are just one other barrier that kind of kicks them back. And particularly if they're a young person of color, any options that are given to them are not meaningful options to be able to actually move forward. So, I don't know if that's how you would sum up part of what you were saying, but that's something that's really hitting home for me. Yeah, and Brett shared so many strategies that they're using as an organization in Texas to move the ball forward in eliminating these fees and fines. And I want to acknowledge that Jason's organization is trying to move a bill package in Michigan to do the same right now as we speak. So I'm curious, Jason, if there are approaches that Brett mentioned or communication strategies that Marcus mentioned that have been maybe more of a challenge in Michigan to push through, or things that they're saying that are resonating with your campaign?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think here in Michigan, there is a strong culture of local control of our juvenile justice system, again, because it's decentralized. So there are courts who have made the decision to either, have really progressive ability to pay waivers, or recognize that the majority of the young people who come in contact with the justice system come from impoverished families or families at the margin, where paying these fines and fees can be really harmful to them, and have decided not to charge families for them. Even some of the things that are state mandated, like the cost of care and services, going against state law because they understand it's the right thing to do. But that's not the case across the board. And so with this bill package that's been introduced, which is a bipartisan bill package, just like Brett mentioned, here in Michigan, it's important that you have Democrats and Republicans in support of legislation like this. Often the pushback that we get is, a question about whether full elimination is the right thing to do, or should there be just standards put in place on collection practices, ability to pay process, and then a cap on the amount that you can charge. So perhaps you don't see those huge amounts that I mentioned earlier. But our response is, one, it'll never be equal, because again, there's communities that don't charge anything. The policies and practices that can really drive huge costs, or the cost of service, really vary county by county. That leads to another conversation about standardization within our system a little bit. But I think that if funding, which is also a concern that's brought up with the legislature or the counties here, who most of our system is managed at the county level, bring up concerns about revenue, though we would encourage courts to look at, similar to other courts that have here, Wayne and Macomb County, look at their assessments and look at what their revenue they're bringing in after reconciling the costs of collection, and then realizing or looking at what kind of revenues they're actually bringing in and comparing that to the harms that they're causing to families. They may realize that it's not worth the trouble, worth the harm, and worth the barriers that they're putting into place to rehabilitation.
Thanks, Jason. And, best of luck with the journey going forward. I know that there have been those wins that you mentioned already on the local level, and to some extent, your organization has been involved with those, which are big things to recognize, separate and aside from the state work. We have some questions rolling in, and I want to encourage our viewers to throw out any question you have, big or small. We recognize many of you are kind of new to this topic, so there's no stupid question, as I say. One that's come through, and this is for any of you to answer, is, have you ever seen youth denied access to rehabilitative programs because of an inability to pay fees and fines? Feel free to unmute.
I haven't directly. I would say, though, that, again, one of the problems with our system not having standards are there are young people who will be placed in, high cost facilities, given punitive measures that another young person who may commit the same offense, have the same situation in another community, may not have to face. And there's many reasons for that. Like, we've heard courts who do not have great evidence-based community programs. And so their options are either do nothing for a child who needs some sort of service or maybe accountability, or go to the extreme or maybe over-rely on a punitive measure, and then the family pays the price for that. And I'd also say that, there are a lot of young people, and I'm sure this is a common story across the country, whose family think that the juvenile justice system is their one opportunity to get help, to get the treatment that they weren't able to access in the community before justice system involvement. And we believe that it's tragic that, for their thanks, they're charged something that could make their situation worse.
That resonates a lot. Brett, Marcus, any thoughts on that question? So another question that's coming through is, what keeps you all hopeful about this work? Because, here we are talking about kids paying costs per night for their jail cell that rival the cost for a 4-star hotel room, right? Or like kids paying tens of thousands of dollars for the privilege of being on a probation GPS tether. It's a lot of money. It's a complex system. Sometimes in your states, it varies by county that how this is happening. So there's a lot of deep investigative work that goes into gathering the data. So yeah, what's keeping you all hopeful in this movement, this national campaign to get debt-free justice for kids? And Brett, I think maybe you should start.
Sure. I mean, obviously we had some success, and I want to give credit to the Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic who worked with us on that. And, if you go to their website, you'll see that they've done this in places that you wouldn't think would be the first actors, like Louisiana, not exactly who you think would be leading the charge on getting rid of charges or fees and fines. So I think, that is definitely part of it, is in that it's not, that there has been some success. And, I was on the access of sort of the access to rehabilitation programs. I haven't seen like somebody be like, no, you can't do X, Y, or Z, but the broader effect is that it denies children access, right? To so many things. Like I think Marcus talked about, kind of denied him access to college. So obviously there's so many examples of that. But I mean, I think in the juvenile justice space, sometimes when you feel like we're so divided in our country, that this is a place where we aren't as divided. And so there is cause and reason to be hopeful. I think, it's sort of getting rid of these sort of bureaucracies and sort of institutional racism. I mean, it doesn't make it easy. Those are still really hard things to get rid of, but at least we're not, we all can be focused on rehabilitation together. And I think that is a reason to be hopeful about it. It doesn't make it easy or a given, and we certainly always don't get all that we want. But I think that the wins that we've gotten are proof that, and evidence that we're on the right track, and we just need to stay the course and continue, working on it.
Thanks, Brett. Marcus, what's keeping you hopeful about this work?
Yeah, I would say as well, like the victories that I see in different states and champion, and just lets me know that it's possible. And then like I have 3 sons, and I wish for a world where they can not have to have stories similar to mine about like there was a bill recently passed in Philadelphia with the driving, where they're not going to be stopping people for driving. Like I've been stopped maybe 15 times, and I was arrested one time because I had a gun at the time. But for a person that it's not like I never was arrested any other time that I was stopped because they didn't have any reason to be stopping me in the first place. It was just like, it's just what happens when you're my complexion and you drive. I was doing Uber Eats and DoorDash and stuff like that. So I was on the road a lot. And it's like whenever a certain type of police officer sees you, you can expect to be pulled over. I just expected it was just a process. And I just really just hope that, just even seeing something like that bill being passed, I could feel like maybe my sons, when they learn how to drive, they won't have that. As many things I can try to protect my kids from not having to go through, and as many more young people to not have to go through, because it's hard enough just growing into an adult. It's hard enough to be able to, come into, figuring out what you want to do in life and just trying to be successful and having a family and loving, and like the system doesn't really the system doesn't look at children like children. And as much as I can do to kind of change that, I'm all in.
Yeah, I think this is what it all boils down to, is we want to treat young people as young people, no matter their race, no matter where they're from. And this issue folds into that philosophy that it sounds like all of our work centers on. So thanks so much to Marcus, Jason, and Brett for joining Nickel today to talk about debt-free justice, as we call it. I share my colleagues' hopefulness about the possibility to eliminate these fees and fines, and we're excited to keep moving forward with them. Here at the National Center for Youth Law, we are part of a national campaign called Debt-Free Justice. And you can learn more about that national campaign by visiting debtfreejustice.org and following the hashtag #DebtFreeJustice on Twitter and Instagram and probably other social media that I don't understand. But again, thank you all for the work you're doing in Pennsylvania, Texas, Michigan, across the country to support young people to be free of this debt and move forward with their lives. We really appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Atasi, and thank you to our wonderful panel. This has been Hidden in Plain Sight, the Racist Economy of Court Fees and Fines, presented by the National Center for Youth Law, which is proud to celebrate 50 years of impact in 2021. We want to extend special thanks to the sponsors of today's event, Kaker, Van Nest, and Peters, Ross, Arenstam, and Moritz, Kirkland and Ellis, and Beneficial State Bank. We look forward to sharing more Nickel Live events with you starting in 2022. This concludes our event. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All right, everybody, take care. You say bye, man.